When the police burst into Arthur McNeil's house, they didn't expect to face a retired general who had served his country for 30 years. The wrongful raid shocked Brookhaven and exposed systemic bias. Confronted with injustice, Arthur made a decision that changed his life and the town's future. The quiet of Brookhaven seemed almost timeless, a peaceful lull that settled over the well-kept lawns, tidy fences, and warm-lit porches. It was a neighborhood where the rustling leaves of ancient oaks whispered stories only they remembered. Inside one of these homes, Arthur McNeil sat in his study, a room brimming with memories of a life marked by duty and sacrifice. The photographs of fellow servicemen, the medals that once gleamed proudly on his uniform, and the aged flags that spoke of battles fought and won, surrounded him like silent sentinels. Arthur's gray hair, neatly combed, contrasted with the sharpness in his eyes, a look that had not softened despite his 67 years. The room smelled faintly of aged wood and the bergamot of his tea. He held the cup close, savoring the warmth as he turned another page of the worn history book in his lap. Notes crowded the margins, tiny echoes of his thoughts captured in the slant of his handwriting, offering quiet commentary on the lives and lessons recorded in print. The steady hum of the fan was a backdrop to the occasional creak of the house settling, blending into the peaceful night. Then came the first hint that something was amiss. A distant screech, faint at first, grew louder, morphing into the unmistakable sound of tires skidding over asphalt. Arthur's muscles tensed, the years of training thrumming beneath the surface. He set his cup down carefully, the delicate clink breaking the silence as his mind began to race. The sirens followed, a wail that cut through the night like a blade, sharp and dissonant. Arthur's gaze shifted to the window, where the darkness outside fractured into a chaotic mix of red and blue strobe lights. The rhythmic flashing cast restless shadows across his walls, throwing the room into a jarring play of color and silhouette. Each reflection seemed to claw at the room's serenity, replacing it with a foreboding tension. He stood slowly, muscles remembering the battle readiness that had defined much of his life. Even now, the instinct for control, for action, took hold. Outside, voices barked commands with an urgency that reverberated through the neighborhood. "Police! Open up!" The demand echoed in the stillness, hammering at the peaceful facade that moments ago had seemed unbreakable. Arthur's heartbeat quickened, not out of fear, but from a controlled surge of adrenaline. His mind sharpened, cataloging the situation as if he were once again commanding troops in an uncertain battlefield. He approached the front door, each step imbued with the memory of long marches, of steel nerves that once guided his actions in the face of the unknown. The noise outside crescendoed. Boots thudded on gravel, radios crackled with clipped voices, and the metallic sound of weapons being readied reached his ears. Arthur's hand reached for the handle, finger steady, when the moment splintered apart. A thunderous crash erupted as the door smashed inward, slamming into the wall with a force that rattled the frames on the wall and sent a shiver through the floorboards. The room was flooded with harsh light and chaos. Time seemed to slow, each second dragging out as figures poured in, shouting commands and sweeping the space with trained precision. But Arthur McNeil stood tall, his eyes meeting theirs with the unyielding defiance of a man who had faced more than they could imagine. This was his home, his sanctuary, and at this moment, it had become a new kind of battlefield. What would come next would reshape everything Arthur and the residents of Brookhaven thought they knew about justice, respect, and the silent biases that lurked behind polite smiles. The police burst through the front door, their entry a whirlwind of motion and noise that shattered the stillness of Arthur McNeil's home. Their presence was overwhelming. Figures clad in dark uniforms, armed, eyes scanning every corner with sharp, practiced precision. The weight of authority and adrenaline filled the air, leaving it almost tangible. The lead officer, a tall man with a rugged, weathered face and closely cropped hair, stepped in first, weapon raised, eyes fixed with unwavering focus. "Face down! Now!" he shouted, his voice powerful and clipped, reverberating off the walls and sending a shiver through the objects that adorned the room. The framed photos trembled on their hooks, medals clinked softly against the wood, and a porcelain figurine on a side table tottered precariously. The command, raw and sharp, seemed to slice through the space, replacing the room's earlier tranquility with a suffocating urgency. Arthur stood motionless in the middle of it all, the calm at the center of a sudden storm. His back was straight, and his eyes, though older and softened by years, still held that look of unflinching resolve. Memories of commanding troops, facing the chaos of battle, rushed back to him in an instant, and his muscles tensed instinctively. But there was no fear, only a deep, simmering disbelief that this was happening within the four walls of his sanctuary. He held the officer's gaze, his voice cutting through the noise with surprising strength. "What is going on here?" The officer, eyes narrowed, kept his weapon steady, his stance unyielding. "You are suspected of involvement in illegal activity." The words were delivered with a cold efficiency, devoid of any trace of empathy. To him, this was just another operation, another moment in a long string of days marked by confrontations. Meanwhile, the rest of the officers moved with methodical intensity, their boots thumping across the wooden floor, each step adding a new note to the cacophony. Cupboards were wrenched open, the metallic clang echoing as doors swung and slammed. Books were swept off shelves, thudding to the floor in scattered heaps, and drawers were pulled with such force that their contents spilled out, a jumble of papers and small objects clattering across the room. Furniture groaned as it was shifted and shoved aside in their pursuit of evidence, and the once organized study transformed into a scene of disarray. Outside, the commotion drew the attention of the neighborhood. The quiet street now buzzed with life as residents emerged, drawn by the flashing lights that painted their homes in red and blue hues. Conversations hummed through the air, a mix of concern, shock, and curiosity. Neighbors whispered and craned their necks for a better look, some pressing phones to their ears to share the unfolding event, while others recorded, their screens reflecting the chaos like tiny, shaky mirrors. The crowd grew, a sea of faces lit by the pulsing strobe, eyes wide with disbelief as they watched Arthur McNeil's home, the symbol of respect and history in their community, become the epicenter of an unsettling spectacle. The noise, the lights, the shouts, it all blended into a sensory storm, one that seemed to bend the fabric of the moment until it felt suspended, stretched taut with the weight of expectation. The air was thick with more than just tension. It buzzed with the potential for something irreversible, something that would mark this night as more than just a disruption, but as a turning point. And standing amidst it all, Arthur felt that charge, the invisible line between who he had been, who he was now, and what this moment would demand of him. One officer, a young man with sharp features and light eyes, noticed the gleaming medals and photographs of Arthur in formal military attire displayed on the wall. His gaze swept over the images, Arthur surrounded by soldiers, at ceremonies, being awarded. In one photo, the former general stood before a large American flag, his eyes filled with confidence and determination. The officer froze, and his certainty started to waver. He turned his head slowly, meeting the eyes of a colleague whose expression mirrored doubt and dawning realization. "Sir," the young officer stammered, his voice shaky. "Did you serve?" The words cracked through the noise, breaking the only silence marked by the sounds of the search and the murmuring of neighbors outside. Arthur nodded, his gaze steady and his head held high. "Over 30 years. I was a general," he said, and his words landed like a hammer, bringing a suffocating stillness. The commander of the operation, a man with a severe expression and commanding voice, who had been issuing orders with unshakable certainty, suddenly hesitated. His face darkened with confusion. He realized the gravity of the situation. They had invaded the home of a man whose service to the country was unparalleled, who had served with honor and courage. The officers exchanged glances, and the tension in the room shifted into a heavy unease. It soon became clear that their actions had been a grave mistake. The abrupt incursion into the home of a respected veteran, whose life had been devoted to national defense, was a glaring and unjust blunder. After a few moments, the commander, sensing the weight and gravity of the situation, finally gathered himself and ordered, "Fall back." The police began to withdraw slowly, their eyes avoiding Arthur's. Their faces were grim and confused, and the silence was cut with palpable tension. The commander, slightly lowering his weapon, stepped closer to Arthur and muttered, "Sorry for the disturbance, sir." But his voice held no real sincerity, just a weak attempt to mitigate the damage. Arthur stood tall, his shoulders squared, and his gaze cold and calculating, like a man used to command. He paused before speaking, his voice quiet but firm. "Your apologies are not enough." The words, spoken with iron resolve, made the commander freeze. Outside, the noise grew louder. Journalists had arrived, reacting quickly to the spreading news. Cameras captured the scene, and the flashes of their lights illuminated the porch, capturing moments that would soon spread through the news feeds. Onlookers whispered to each other, some live streaming, others posting online about the appalling incident. From that day, serious discussions about systemic bias and issues within law enforcement began. Arthur, a man for whom honor and dignity were paramount, did not intend to let this incident be forgotten. He resolved to use it as a platform for fighting for justice and reform. His experience, authority, and unyielding belief in truth became the driving force that soon united people around the idea of necessary change.